Hey everybody, welcome to Every Day with Ron Stasko. It is day 25, and if you've been following along, we've been traveling through Genesis and Mark and popping around on some of the Psalms. Today is one of those catch-up days. I thought it would be a good day to spend more time talking about Joseph. Joseph, when we met him, we knew of his birth, but really he doesn't come back into play. We really don't get to know him as a person until chapter 37 of Genesis, when he was 17, and he was a young man tending flocks with his brothers. He was kind of like his father's favorite out of all of his children, because Joseph was the son that he got from his wife that he loved, and that was Rachel. He worked 14 years to be with Rachel. That is a deep love. And he had to wait many years before she had a son of her own. And so he had a special place in his father's heart, and he basically was daddy's boy. He kept an eye on his brothers. He would tell them if they were doing right or if they were doing bad. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. It says that in verse 3 of 37, because he had been born to him in his old age. And so he made him this richly ornamented robe, and his brothers saw that, and they were jealous of him because of it. They actually hated him and would not speak kindly of him. They felt like he was the spoiled brat. But Joseph was close to God, and he was also gifted in being able to see dreams and interpret dreams. And he was also a handsome young man, and he was a hard worker, very diligent. And he has this dream that he tells his brothers about in verse 6. He says, "Hey, I had this dream. We were all binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright, and all your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." Well, when you have a bunch of jealous brothers, 10 jealous brothers, that don't like you already, they don't want to hear you being a 17-year-old snot-nosed punk when some of them are twice his age, telling him, "You're going to bow down to me." And they challenge him, saying, "Do you intend to reign over us, or will you actually rule us?" And they hated him even more because of the dream. And then sometime later he had another dream and told his brothers, "Hey, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Now he had a younger brother whose name was Benjamin, that was also from his mother Rachel. And he told his father about the dream as well as his brothers, and this actually really upset his father, and he rebuked him, saying, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down on the ground before you? His brothers were jealous, and his father, even though he was angry, he kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers hated him so much that they decided to plot against him. His father told him to go and check on his brothers, and so he went down to check on them. They weren't where they were supposed to be, and a man there told him, keep going down to Dothan, they're down there. So he went down to Dothan, and on the way there they saw him in the distance, and they decided to plot to kill him. You know your brother's got to hate you pretty bad if they want to kill you. And he's clueless. I mean, he's just clueless. 17-year-old kid. Just high idealism. You know, not a care in the world. Just doing what Dad says and living the good life and being the favored son. And they said, here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we will see what comes of his dreams. They're still ticked off about the dreams. Now Reuben's the oldest brother, and when he heard this, he attempted to rescue his younger brother, second youngest brother, from their hands, and saying, let's not take his life. Don't shed any blood. Just throw him into the cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Now, since he was the oldest brother and had some authority, they listened. And Reuben's plan was to come back in the evening and rescue him and bring him back to his father. So when Joseph came up to check on them, they harassed him and stripped off his robe. They took him and they threw him into a cistern. Now, a cistern is a big, giant bowl, okay, dug into the ground, usually about 6 or 7 feet deep. And the reason that it's maybe 5 to 7 feet deep, 5 to 6 feet deep, and the purpose is to take grain into the hole and put it on these large screens and shake it and throw it up into the air so that the wind above the ground can take the husks, or what they call chaff, all the particles that are not the seed or the kernel, and blow them away from the actual seeds. And then once they have sifted all that out of there, the grain is clean, and then they take the grain out and bag it to take it to market. So the cisterns were empty, and so they threw them down in there, and if you're in a 6-foot deep bowl, it's going to be very hard to get out of it. So they threw them down in the cistern, and there was no water in it. They sat down and they ate their meal, and as they looked up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and it was on its way to Egypt. So Judah, the second oldest brother, said, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. So you got 2 of the older brothers being a little wise and saying, don't kill him. But he hates him enough that he'll sell him as a slave and profit off of their brother. So these 8 brothers, or 9 brothers, sell him and split the money. The merchants came up and they pulled Joseph out of the well the cistern, and they sold them for 20 shekels. Basically, they got 2 shekels each for their brother. And they took him to Egypt. Now, Reuben had come back from where he was in the fields, and he saw that Joseph was not there, and he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe. They came up with a plan. They slaughtered a goat, dipped his robe in the blood, and they took the robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." And Jacob recognized the robe, and he said, "It's his son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Surely he has been torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and mourned for his son many days. Back then, the custom was to place yourself into an uncomfortable position when you're grieving. Sackcloth was a burlap sack, basically. It was real itchy and scratchy and uncomfortable, and they would wear this sack instead of clothing. And mourned for many days. Now all of the other children came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, in my mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." And his father wept for him, so he was deeply grieved over the matter. Now the merchants went down to Egypt, and they sold Joseph to Potiphar, which was one of Pharaoh's officials. He was the captain of the guard. And Joseph basically went from being free to being a slave after being beaten up by his brothers and sold out to being placed into the ownership of an Egyptian leader. So he went to another established household. The captain of the guard basically was in charge of the army. And he put Joseph to work inside of his home. And he had him live in the house. And then when his master saw that the Lord was with Joseph and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did, he found favor in the eyes of his owner and became his personal attendant. So he was bought as a slave. And because he did everything well, Potiphar grew to know him and trust him and put him in charge of his household. And he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. Now, I don't have anybody like that in my life, but I would sure love to have someone that I entrusted everything I owned, so that I didn't have to do anything but think about what I was going to eat today. The closest person I have in that position is my wife. But I don't own her. We are one. We are married and happy. And we submit to each other equally. Here he was basically a hired servant, but with no pay. So from the time that Joseph was put in charge of Potiphar's household, the Lord blessed the household of that Egyptian because of Joseph. And the blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he put him in charge of everything. The production of the farming, the affairs of the household, making sure that the cattle was fed and the plants were watered and the bills were paid, and all he had to do was worry about what he was going to eat and go take care of the business of the Pharaoh. So Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph, said, "Come to bed with me." So here's a ruler home alone because her husband is out doing military things for the king. She's alone in the house, and there's a handsome young man there that's taking care of everything. He's basically the head of the house. So she wants to play house. She wants to have sex. But Joseph refused. He says, "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in this house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" So he basically calls her out and says, "Hey, I know my position. I know my place. I am higher than you in this house when it comes to my master's affairs. Why would I do anything to go against my master and sin against God?" So what does she do? She continues to speak to Joseph day after day, and he refuses to go to bed with her or even be around her. So he starts avoiding her because she keeps pressing him, and what he probably should have done was go to his master and say, "Hey, I need to talk to you about something," and tell him what was going on. But he did not. And so one day he goes into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the servants are inside. So his master's wife seizes the opportunity, catches him by his cloak, and says, "Come to bed with me." But he panics. He runs out, leaves his cloak behind. And so when she sees that he ain't gonna do it, and that the cloak is still in her hand, and that he ran out of the house, she saw an opportunity. And so she calls the servants, screaming, "Look! This Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard my scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." There was no one inside to witness it, so it was her word against his. What's going to happen in that situation? The slave or the master's wife is going to win. So she keeps the cloak next to her until her husband comes home. And then she tells the husband this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." So she's mad at Joseph because she won't sleep with him. Joseph ran out of the house to get away from the situation. The master hears this, and of course he's furious because he gave this slave rule over his entire dominion, and he feels betrayed. The problem is the person betraying him is actually his wife and not his servant. And so he goes after Joseph and has him put into prison, where the king's prisoners are confined. Now, it doesn't say if Joseph got to explain himself. It doesn't say if he had feelings for the woman. It doesn't say that Potiphar even listened. It just states what happened. But here's a guy that did everything right, saw the guy was blessing his position, even though he was a slave, he had a really good life. And so he stayed faithful in his time of trial. And then he's put into prison, which is like, now you've gone from being a slave to being raised up. Now you're put all the way into the dungeon, basically the lowest place you can be in a kingdom. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. So even though he's going through these peaks and valleys, the Lord is with him through this whole process. And he showed Joseph kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So Potiphar's golden boy is put in prison. It's going to draw some attention. The warden sees that, knows that, and keeps an eye on him. And then learns more about the man. And so, knowing what he did for the captain of the guard, he decides to take advantage of the situation and starts putting Joseph in charge of the prisoners. And he made him responsible for all the work that was done in the prison. So, over time, Joseph basically becomes the assistant prison warden. And the prison warden has to pay no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him a success in whatever he did. Because Joseph stayed faithful, because he stayed true, because he kept doing the things he was supposed to do, even in the most difficult situations, God blessed it and people noticed. He was never number one, but he was always raised up to a position of leadership, even in the midst of his trials. When sometime later the cupbearer and the baker of the king are sent into the prison, here comes two more officials that are in the king's court. And Joseph already had some stature, and he has stature in the prison, so he becomes friends with these guys. He's checking on them and finds out that they had these dreams, and they're disturbed by the dreams. And asks them why they're sad, and they said they both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them. And he comforts them and encourages them, saying, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So they tell him their dreams, and the cupbearer finds out that he's going to be restored in 3 days, and the baker finds out that his head's going to be chopped off in 3 days. Now, they had this big feast. The cupbearer and the chief baker go up. The cupbearer is reinstated, and the chief baker is hung in the courts in front of all the guests as part of the show. And what he asked the cupbearer to do was remember me. But the cupbearer forgot him. He was just glad to be out. He saw that Joseph was right about him, and the other man was probably too scared to say anything to the king. So he just kept it tucked in his hat. But I'm sure that this would have been very discouraging to Joseph, who was hoping that after day 4 or day 5 or day 7 or day 10 or even 30 days after, that someone would have said something. It wouldn't be until 2 full years later that someone remembers anything. And so he's running a prison for 2 more years after he'd been in there for some time. So it's a young man that basically spent probably a decade of his life as a slave or in prison as a slave, but was put into power each time and blessed, and actually probably had a better life than most in the same situation because of the favor of God and because of his faithfulness to God. He never gave up on his relationship through 10 years of darkness. And that was why Joseph is so important to me. Because in my own life, I've had periods of darkness, and it seemed like years. And if it wasn't for seeing an example of a young man that's tried to do everything right and get just clocked time after time after time by life, I would give up. But because of God and because of his favor and because of this man Joseph, I had a role model to encourage me not to give up, and stay faithful, work hard, keep doing what you're supposed to do. And a lot like Joseph, I've been that number 2 guy on several occasions and been blessed. And so I thank God for Joseph, and I thank God for his favor. If there's anything that you are struggling with, or that you would like prayer for, or that you've been thinking of, or you need encouragement in, something you're struggling with, or something that's just really awesome, please share it in the feed, and I'd love to talk about it tomorrow. Take care. We'll see you next time on Every Day.